At my son's engagement party, his fiancée stood up, pointed at me and said, "Get up and leave. You don't belong here." The room went silent. I looked at my son, hoping he would defend me. Instead, he glanced at his watch and said, "She's right, Dad." My heart turned cold. I didn't argue. I simply fixed my jacket and walked toward the door. Then a voice behind me said, "This party reeks of garbage." When I turned around, every VIP guest was standing. Before we go any further, thank you for being here. It means more than you know. Drop a comment and tell me, where are you watching from? Your city, your country. I'd love to know who's in this room with me tonight. A quick note. This story contains fictional elements woven in for storytelling purposes. Any similarity to names or places is coincidental, but the lesson it carries is entirely real. The evening started the way most lies do, beautifully. The restaurant was called Aurelius, tucked into the upper floors of a brownstone on East 72nd Street. The kind of place where the lighting is always just dim enough to make everyone look better than they are. White flowers on every table, crystal glasses that caught the candlelight and threw it back in pieces. A jazz quartet in the corner playing something soft enough to disappear into. 60 guests in their finest moving through the room like they'd rehearsed it. I arrived at 7 o'clock sharp the way my father taught me. On time for everything, early for nothing. I wore the charcoal suit I'd had for 11 years. The one Margaret always said made me look like a man who didn't need to prove anything. I stood at the entrance for a moment and looked at the room, and the first thing I felt wasn't pride or joy or any of the things a father is supposed to feel at his son's engagement party. The first thing I felt was that I didn't belong there, not because I wasn't welcome. I told myself it was the suit, or the shoes, or maybe just the age on my hands, the slowness in my step that 69 years will give you whether you want it or not. But looking back now, I think some part of me already knew. Some part of me had been knowing for a while. I sat down and looked for Ethan. My eyes moved across the room, first the clusters of guests, the bar, the VIP section, near the far window where a handful of faces I didn't recognize sat, with the particular stillness of people who had come to observe rather than perform. I didn't linger on any of them. At that point, I had no reason to. He was working the room the way he always did. At these things, handshakes timed perfectly. Laughter arriving right on cue, leaning in when he spoke, to make whoever he was talking to feel like the most important person alive. He had his mother's eyes, and my stubbornness, and somewhere along the way, he'd turned both into tools. I watched him move from one cluster of guests to the next, and I tried to find the boy I used to know in the man he'd become. There was something in his face I couldn't name. Not happiness. Something more deliberate than that. The focus of a person executing a plan. "Arthur." Richard Miller extended his hand across the table, his smile wide and efficient. Richard was Vanessa's father, a man who'd built a real estate empire in New Jersey through a combination of political connections and what he politely called aggressive negotiation. He was wearing a watch I recognized, limited edition, the kind you had to know someone to get. "Good of you to make it." "Richard." I shook his hand. "Lovely evening." "Isn't it?" His wife Eleanor was already turning back to the woman beside her, their conversation too important to interrupt, for a retired fund manager from Greenwich. Richard's eyes moved past me almost immediately, scanning for someone more useful. I picked up my water glass and looked at the room. Vanessa stood near the bar in a white dress that seemed to generate its own light. She held a champagne flute like a prop she'd been trained to use, and she smiled at the right people with the precision of someone who had studied which smiles opened which doors. She was beautiful in the way that certain cities are beautiful, impressive from a distance, exhausting up close. She hadn't looked at me since I walked in. Ethan finally caught my eye from across the room. He raised his chin, the smallest possible acknowledgement. Then someone touched his arm, and he turned away. I told myself it was fine. The evening moved forward. Courses arrived and were taken away. Conversations bloomed and faded. I spoke to the man on my left, a contractor I vaguely recognized from some development deal years ago, and to the woman on my right, who turned out to be Eleanor Miller's college roommate and wanted to talk about Palm Beach. I laughed when laughing seemed appropriate. I answered questions when questions were asked. I was present the way furniture is present, necessary for the room to function, but not the point of it. It was somewhere around 8 o'clock between the salad course and whatever came next when Vanessa's voice cut through the room. She didn't tap a glass. She didn't clear her throat. She simply stood up and the room adjusted to her the way rooms did for people who expected them to. "Mr. Hayes?" Her voice was even, almost pleasant. The kind of voice you use when you want to sound reasonable while doing something that isn't. Every head at the table turned. I looked up from my plate. Vanessa's eyes were fixed on me, and her finger, she actually raised her finger and pointed the way you'd point at something you wanted removed from a room, was aimed directly at my face. "Stand up," she said, "and get out. You're making this evening uncomfortable." The jazz quartet kept playing for exactly 2 more seconds before they noticed the silence spreading through the room like something spilled and stopped. I sat very still. Later, people would ask me what I was thinking in that moment, and the honest answer is that I wasn't thinking at all. I was listening. Not to Vanessa, her words had already landed, and I'd already decided what they meant. I was listening for Ethan. I turned my head and found my son standing 6 feet away. He was still holding his champagne glass. His jaw was set. His eyes moved from Vanessa to me, and I watched something pass across his face, a calculation fast and almost invisible. Then he looked down at the watch on his wrist, a new watch. Rose gold slim profile, something he'd started wearing in the last few months. He looked at it the way people look at their phones when they want to be seen as too busy to respond, and he let out a single quiet breath through his nose. "She has a point, Dad," he said. His voice was low-controlled and completely steady. "You arrived late. Mom would have understood the importance of timing at something like this." He used her name, her absence, like punctuation, like something to end the conversation with. The blood in my chest went cold and very still. I looked around the table. Richard Miller was inspecting his wine glass. Eleanor Miller had her hand pressed lightly to her pearls. A dozen faces I'd known for years were suddenly fascinated by their napkins, their plates, the middle distance. The room had made its choice. Not loudly, not with cruelty. Just with that particular New York silence that means we're going to pretend we didn't see this. Vanessa sat back down with the ease of someone who'd just settled a minor administrative matter. My hands were flat on the tablecloth. I could feel the linen under my fingertips. I pressed down not in anger but because I needed something solid. 69 years, 38 of them as this man's father. I thought of Margaret. I thought of what she used to say about the moments that define you, not the big ones you see coming, but the small ones that arrive without warning and ask you very quietly who you actually are. I pulled my chair back. The sound it made against the floor was the only sound in the room. I straightened my jacket, adjusted my lapel, and I stood up. I had taken exactly 3 steps toward the door when I heard it. Not a crash, not a shout. Just the slow, deliberate sound of liquid being poured unhurried like someone taking their time with something that mattered. I stopped walking. Behind me, the room had already gone the kind of quiet that happens when everyone present understands all at once that something is occurring, that none of them will be able to pretend they didn't witness. I turned around. A man was standing at the far end of the table. He'd risen from one of the VIP seats near the window. The seats I hadn't paid much attention to when I came in, the ones where Ethan's most important guests had been placed. The man was tall, somewhere in his early 70s, with silver hair cut close and a dark navy suit that fit the way suits fit when they're made specifically for the body wearing them. His face was the kind of face that didn't announce itself. Calm lines, steady eyes. The face of someone who had long ago stopped needing to impress anyone. He was holding a glass of red wine, and he was emptying it. Slowly, steadily, with the unhurried deliberateness of a man who had made his decision before he stood up. The deep red liquid ran in a wide arc across the front of Vanessa's white dress and pooled in the folds of the fabric at her lap. Vanessa made a sound I'd never heard from her before. Something between a gasp and a word that didn't form, her hands flying up in a gesture of pure, unscripted shock. For the first time all evening, the careful architecture of her composure simply fell away. Her face went pale, then flushed, then pale again, cycling through colors like she couldn't decide which one was appropriate for a moment she hadn't planned for. The man set the empty glass on the table with a soft final click. He didn't look at Vanessa. He looked directly at Richard Miller, who had frozen mid-breath across the table, his expensive watch catching the candlelight, his mouth open with nothing inside it. "This party," the man said, and his voice was the quietest thing in the room, which made it the loudest, reeks of garbage. He straightened his cufflinks, one then the other. The motion was so unhurried it felt like punctuation. Then he turned and walked toward me. I stood in the middle of the room with 60 people looking in our direction and tried to process what I was witnessing. I had no context for this man. I didn't recognize his face. I didn't know his name. And yet the room around him was reacting to his presence, the way rooms react to gravity. Everything quietly orienting itself in his direction. He reached me and stopped. He didn't smile exactly, but something in his expression shifted the way a held breath shifts when it's finally released. "Arthur," he said, not a question. Before I could respond, the first chair scraped back. It came from the left side of the table, a man I recognized as the president of a regional bank that Ethan had spent the better part of 3 months trying to cultivate. He stood without announcement, reached for his jacket on the back of his chair, and folded it over his arm. He gave me a single nod, the brief and sufficient kind, and then moved toward the door. Then another chair. A woman who ran one of the larger construction conglomerates in the tri-state area. She pressed her napkin to the table, picked up her clutch, and walked toward the exit without a word. Then another, and another. No one was coordinating. No one was waiting for a signal. It was simply that once one person moved, the next one found it easier to move, and then the one after that, until the process had its own momentum, and the room was thinning out the way a tide goes out, gradually, inevitably, without drama. Vanessa was on her feet now, a linen napkin pressed against the front of her dress, her eyes working the room with a desperation she was barely managing to conceal. She turned to Ethan, and I watched my son's face do something complicated, the performance of confidence meeting the reality of a situation that had departed entirely from whatever script he'd been running. "Ethan," she said. Just his name. But the way she said it was a whole conversation. Ethan looked at the departing guests. He looked at Vanessa. He looked at his father. His mouth opened and closed once, and for just a moment, I saw the boy again, not the CEO, not the man who'd checked his watch, while his mother's memory was used as a weapon, just a boy who didn't know what to do next. Richard Miller had pushed back from the table and was speaking in a low, urgent voice to Eleanor, who was gathering her things with the practiced efficiency of a woman accustomed to graceful exits. But there was nothing graceful about this. The color in Eleanor's cheeks was the bright, ugly red of humiliation. I watched all of it. I didn't move toward the door, and I didn't move back to my seat. I stood in the center of the room and let the moment be what it was. In under 2 minutes, more than half the VIP section was empty. Glasses left half full. Napkins dropped on chairs. A low murmur ran through the remaining guests, the civilian guests, the ones who hadn't risen, who were now looking at each other with the wide-eyed, uncertain expressions of people watching a weather event they hadn't been forecasted. The man in the navy suit had stopped beside me. He waited. He seemed entirely comfortable with the chaos unfolding around us, the way certain people are comfortable in storms, because they've stood in enough of them to understand that storms end. I finally turned to look at him properly. "I don't believe we've met," I said. My voice came out steadier than I expected. "No," he agreed. "Not formally. Not in a very long time." He paused, studying my face with an expression I couldn't quite categorize. "You won't remember me. You did something for my family 30 years ago that you probably thought was a small thing. It wasn't." I opened my mouth. He shook his head slightly. "Not here," he said. "Outside." We walked to the exit side by side, and I didn't look back at the table. I didn't look back at Ethan, who I could feel watching me from across the ruined room. I didn't look at Vanessa, who was saying something sharp and quiet to one of the restaurant staff, her jaw tight, her dress still dark with wine. We stepped through the door. The maitre d' stood to one side, his face composed in the professional blankness of someone paid specifically to witness things like this without reacting. The elevator opened. We stepped in, the doors closed, and in the silence of that descent, the man beside me glanced at his reflection in the polished metal doors and said so quietly I almost missed it beneath the hum of the cables, "It's been 30 years, Arthur. I'm sorry it took something like this to bring us back to the same room." My throat tightened. Something in his voice, not the words, but the weight underneath them, reached back through decades and touched something I hadn't thought about in years. I stared at our reflections side by side in the metal. Two old men one evening, one question I wasn't sure I was ready to ask. Because if he was who I was starting to think he was, then nothing about tonight was as simple as I'd believed when I walked through that door at 7 o'clock. Outside, the city moved the way it always does, indifferent, relentless, completely unbothered by whatever had just happened on the third floor of a restaurant on East 72nd Street. The October air hit my face the moment we stepped through the front door. Cold enough to sting the kind of autumn night that feels like a warning about what's coming. A line of black cars idled along the curb, drivers standing with their hands folded, watching the stream of guests filter out with expressions that gave away nothing. Down the block, a group of people in ordinary clothes were laughing about something ordinary. The world outside had no idea. Victor Stone stopped a few feet from the entrance and turned to face me. Up close in the amber glow of the streetlights, I could finally look at him properly. The silver hair, the steady eyes, the face that carried its years without apology. There was something in the architecture of it, the jaw, the way his mouth held itself that reached back through 30 years and pulled at something I'd nearly stopped trusting. A memory so old it had almost become furniture. "Victor," I said. The name came out carefully like I was testing the weight of it. Victor Stone. His chest rose and fell with something that wasn't quite a sigh and wasn't quite relief. "I wasn't sure you'd get there," he said. "It's been a long time." "It has." My voice came out rougher than I intended. "The last time I saw you, you were 22 years old and sitting across a desk from me in a building that no longer exists in a part of Brooklyn that no longer exists either." Something moved across his face, a ripple of feeling that he didn't try to hide. His jaw tightened, and for just a moment, the billionaire standing in front of me in his $7,000 suit dissolved, and I caught a glimpse of the young man underneath. The one who'd walked into my office with a business plan printed on paper that wasn't quite the right size, with ink slightly smeared on the corner, and eyes that were terrified of being told no. "You remember," he said, and his voice cracked on the second word just barely. "I remember everything about that day," I said. "Your hands were shaking so badly you nearly dropped the folder." He laughed, a short, raw sound, nothing like the polished kind of laugh that fills rooms like the one we'd just left. "They were," he admitted. I'd been turned down 11 times before I got to you. 11 different offices. 11 different ways of telling a 22-year-old kid from a broke family that his ideas weren't worth the paper they were written on. He looked down at the sidewalk for a moment, then back up at me. And then you read the whole thing. Every page. You asked me 3 questions, and then you said, "This is worth something. Let's see what you can build." My throat tightened. "It was a good plan," I said simply. "It deserved a fair read." "Arthur." He said my name like it meant something specific. My father was 3 months from losing the house. My mother had stopped eating dinner so my sister and I could have enough. I had $40 in my checking account and a folder full of ideas that everyone told me were worthless. His eyes went bright, and he blinked hard, jaw working. "What you did wasn't just a business decision. It was the difference between one life and another." I didn't know what to say to that. I never did in moments like that. Margaret always said I was better at doing things than receiving gratitude for them. She wasn't wrong. "How did you end up at that party tonight?" I asked, steering us back toward ground I could stand on. Victor's expression shifted, the warmth still there, but something more careful layering over it. "I got a call 2 weeks ago," he said. "Someone on the event planning side reached out inviting a list of high-profile guests. My name was on it." He paused. "I almost didn't come. I had a dinner in Boston. I canceled it when I saw the name Hayes on the invitation." "You came for me," I said. It wasn't a question. "I came because it had been too long," he said. "And I thought a party people in a good mood, maybe I'd finally get 5 minutes to say what I should have said years ago." He exhaled sharply through his nose. I didn't expect what I walked into. "Neither did I said, and I felt the truth of it sit heavy in my chest, pressing against my ribs from the inside. Victor's eyes hardened slightly. "When she pointed at you like that..." He stopped. His hand flexed at his side, fingers curling and releasing. "I've been in a lot of rooms, Arthur. I've watched a lot of people treat other people badly, because that's what happens when money gives someone the idea that they're above the ordinary rules of decency. But that..." He shook his head once sharply, like he was trying to dislodge the image. "That was something else." "Does Ethan know about us?" I asked. "About what you and I were to each other 30 years ago." Victor looked at me steadily. "No," he said. "He's never asked. Not once in all the times we've crossed paths at various events." A pause. "He introduced me to Vanessa at a gala last spring. She asked me what I did, and when I told her, she spent the rest of the conversation trying to find out whether I'd be useful to their development projects." His mouth pressed into a flat, humorless line. "She never asked how I knew his father." That particular truth sat between us on the sidewalk, solid and cold as the October air. My son had invited 60 people to the most important party of his adult life. And in that room there had been men and women who had known me for decades, who had eaten at my table, who had trusted me with their money during the years when trusting anyone with money was an act of faith, who had called me at 2 in the morning when deals fell through and needed someone to think clearly. And Ethan had looked at every single one of them and seen only what they could do for him. He had never once thought to ask where they came from. "Victor," I said. My voice had gone very quiet. "Thank you for tonight, for what you did in there." He shook his head firmly. "Don't thank me. I'm 30 years late." He reached out and gripped my shoulder, a brief, solid pressure, the kind that men of a certain generation use when words run out. "Get home safe, Arthur." He turned toward a waiting car. Then he stopped. Without turning back, he said, "You should know I wasn't the only one in that room a night who came because of you." A beat. Not even close. What? The car door opened and closed, and the taillights disappeared into the traffic on 72nd Street. I stood there on the sidewalk alone, the city rushing past on all sides, and felt something settle in my chest, not comfort exactly, but the particular clarity that arrives when you finally understand the shape of a thing you've been looking at for years without seeing. My son didn't know who his father was, and because he didn't know, he thought there was nothing left to lose. 63 miles between Manhattan and Greenwich. On a clear night, with light traffic, an hour and 15 minutes. Long enough to think, too long to stop thinking. I drove with the radio off. The highway unspooled ahead of me, the city lights fading in the rearview mirror, and the Connecticut darkness rising up to take their place. October nights in this part of the world have a particular quality, the kind of deep, settled quiet that makes you feel like the day is done in a way that March nights never quite manage. Somewhere past Stamford, the trees closed in on both sides of the road, and for a stretch of several miles, I was the only car in either direction. I kept both hands on the wheel and let Victor's last words run through my head over and over. Not the only one, not even close. By the time I pulled into the driveway in Greenwich, it was nearly 10 o'clock. The house was dark except for the porch light, which ran on a timer Margaret had set years ago and which I'd never changed, because it meant the house was never completely dark when I came home. Small thing. It mattered more than it should have. I sat in the car for a moment before going inside. Through the windshield, I could see the front window of the living room, the curtains Margaret had chosen, the faint outline of the bookshelf she'd filled over 40 years, with everything from medical textbooks to paperback mysteries. The house looked like a house that was waiting for someone. It always did. I went inside. The living room was exactly as I'd left it. I turned on the reading lamp by the armchair. Margaret's armchair, the one I'd stopped sitting in for 2 years after she died, and then started sitting in again because avoiding it made her more gone, not less. Her photograph was on the shelf above it. The one from our trip to Maine the summer before she got sick. She was laughing at something off camera, her head tilted back slightly, her whole face lit up with it. I sat down in her chair and looked at her photograph and felt the weight of the evening press down on my shoulders like something physical. My phone rang. The name on the screen was one I'd known for 29 years. Gerald Whitmore, retired former president of a mid-sized investment bank, a man who played bad golf and told worse jokes and had never once in 3 decades said anything he didn't mean. I picked up. "Gerald, Arthur." His voice was lower than usual, stripped of its normal ease. "I'm in the car. I've been driving around for half an hour because I didn't want to go home before I called you." "You don't have to." "I do." A pause. The sound of traffic in the background, then less of it, as if he'd turned onto a quieter street. "I want you to know something. Most of us in that room tonight, the people you've known, the people who've worked with you, who've been in your corner for years, we didn't come for the engagement. We came because your name was on the guest list." His voice roughened at the edges. "That's the only reason, Arthur, every single one of us." My hand tightened around the phone. My eyes stung suddenly and unexpectedly, and I pressed my lips together hard. "Gerald?" My voice came out unsteady, and I stopped and started again. "How many of you knew what that Arthur Hayes was going to be there?" He let out a short, gruff sound that was almost a laugh. "Word gets around. You know how these things work. Someone mentions a name, someone else says they're going, and suddenly half the room is showing up for a reason that has nothing to do with the couple." A beat. "Ethan's a capable young man, Arthur. He really is. But those people tonight, the relationships in that room, none of that was built on what he's done. You know that, right?" I looked at Margaret's photograph, her laughing face, the main light behind her. "I built it for him," I said. "Every introduction, every dinner I arranged and didn't attend, every time I called in a favor and made sure his name came up in the right conversation." My voice had gone flat, not from anger, but from the exhaustion of saying out loud something I'd been carrying for years. I thought if he didn't feel indebted, he'd grow more freely. I thought giving without showing was love. Arthur. Gerald's voice cracked just slightly. It was love. It was absolutely love. The problem wasn't what you gave him. The problem was that no one told him where it came from. That sentence landed somewhere in the center of my chest and stayed there aching. We talked for another few minutes. Nothing specific, nothing that needed to be solved that night. Gerald told me to call if I needed anything. I told him I would, knowing we both understood that I probably wouldn't, because that was the kind of man I was, for better and worse. Then we said goodnight, and the call ended, and I sat in Margaret's chair in the quiet house and breathed. After a long moment, I said out loud to the photograph, to the empty room, to whoever might be listening in, whatever comes after a life. I made it too easy for him, Margaret. Too easy to forget where everything came from. The house didn't answer. Houses don't. But sitting in her chair, wrapped in the particular silence of a place that knew you, it felt less like I was talking to nothing, and more like I was finally saying something that had been true for years and needed to be spoken before it could be dealt with. I reached over to the side table to set my phone down. It buzzed in my hand. A message from Daniel Brooks, Samuel, my attorney. For the past 20 years, a man who did not text after 10 o'clock unless he had a specific reason to. The message was short, Arthur. Don't go to sleep yet. There's something about the engagement ring you need to see tonight. I'm sending a file. Look at it when you can. I stared at the words, read them twice. Then I put the phone down on the side table, pushed myself out of the chair, and walked slowly toward my study at the back of the house. The room smelled like old paper and oak, and the particular mustiness of books that had been read and replaced too many times to count. I sat down at my desk, and I opened my laptop. I almost didn't open it. The study was cold, in the way that rooms get cold when no one has spent time in them. Not the cold of a window left open, but the cold of a space that has been waiting. I turned on the desk lamp and pulled my chair out, and sat down in front of the laptop with the particular reluctance of a man who suspects the next few minutes are going to cost him something he can't get back. Daniel's email was already in my inbox, sent at 10:47. The subject line said only, "Review before tomorrow." I opened the attachment. It was a financial summary, 23 pages dense with account numbers and transaction records, and the kind of legal language that takes years to learn to read quickly. I had spent 40 years learning to read it quickly. I read the first page and then went back and read it again more slowly, the way you reread something when you're hoping you misunderstood it the first time. I hadn't misunderstood it. I picked up my phone and called Daniel. He answered on the second ring, which told me he'd been waiting. "You've looked at it," he said. "Not a question." "Walk me through it," I said. My voice came out steadier than I felt. "The ring, start there." I heard him exhale, the careful exhale of a man choosing his words before he releases them. The diamond ring Vanessa was wearing tonight, $400,000, purchased 6 weeks ago from a jeweler on Fifth Avenue. The payment came from a brokerage account in Ethan's name, one that he's been treating as a personal investment account for the past 4 years. But I said because there was clearly a but. But that account sits inside the Hayes family trust structure, Daniel said. It was never formally separated from the trust's asset pool. Ethan has been making withdrawals from it for years, smaller amounts, things that were easy to miss or easy to rationalize. This one was not small, and it was not easy to miss. I pressed my thumb and forefinger against the bridge of my nose and breathed through it. "He thinks it's his money. He thinks it's his money," Daniel confirmed. "But Arthur, you never transferred that account out of the trust. The paperwork to formally separate it was drafted 3 years ago and never signed, which means every dollar in that account is still technically part of the trust corpus, and you are still the sole trustee. The sole trustee, the person with final authority over every asset in that structure. The person whose signature was required for any major transaction to be legitimate. I hadn't signed anything. I hadn't approved anything. I hadn't even known this purchase was being made until 11 o'clock on the night of my son's engagement party. Daniel. My voice came out rough, scraped at the edges. How many other accounts are structured this way? A pause. The kind of pause that means the answer is worse than the question. 7, he said quietly. 7 accounts that Ethan has been treating as his own that remain legally inside the trust structure. The combined value. He stopped. Started again. It's significant, Arthur. We're talking about assets totaling somewhere in the range of $12 to $15 million that he has been drawing from without formal trustee authorization. The number sat in the room with me. $12 to $15 million. Years of decisions made by my son under the assumption that the foundation was his to spend because the man who built the foundation had never thought it necessary to explain that foundations don't work that way. My chest ached with something that wasn't quite anger and wasn't quite grief. It was the specific pain of a mistake you made with the best intentions and can't unmake. He doesn't know, I said. Does he? He genuinely doesn't know the money isn't legally his. I think, Daniel said carefully, that Ethan knows enough to know he's never asked. There's a difference between not knowing and choosing not to find out. A man who asks the right questions discovers the answer. Ethan has never asked the right questions. I looked across the study at the row of framed photographs on the far wall. Ethan, at 8 years old, sitting on my shoulders at a 4th of July parade in Greenwich. Ethan, at 16, holding up a report card with the particular pride of a kid who'd worked for something. Ethan, at 26, the day his first deal closed, calling me from a parking garage because he was so happy he couldn't drive yet. I could feel the space between those photographs and the man I'd watched tonight. The space was enormous, and I had no idea when it had opened. Arthur. Daniel's voice pulled me back. There's more you need to know. Not tonight, it's late, and some of this needs to be laid out properly. But I need you to understand that what I've found so far is not the whole picture. Not by a long way. How bad is it? I asked. Bad enough, he said, that I'd like to meet tomorrow morning. Early. Bring yourself and nothing else. Don't call Ethan. Don't reach out to anyone connected to that party tonight. Just come to the office. 9 o'clock, I said. 8, he said. Please. I ended the call and set the phone face down on the desk. For a long moment, I sat very still, both hands flat on the surface of the desk, feeling the wood grain under my palms. $400,000. A ring on Vanessa Miller's finger paid for with money from a trust that my father had helped me build when I was 31 years old, money that was supposed to carry the Hayes name forward into something meaningful. She had pointed at me in that restaurant and told me to get out, and she had done it wearing something that belonged to me. I pushed back from the desk and reached for the lamp switch and stopped. The bottom drawer of the desk was slightly open. Not much. An inch, maybe less. But I could see the edge of something inside it. A corner of cream-colored paper, slightly yellowed, the kind of heavy stock that comes from a good stationery store. I knew that paper. I knew that handwriting on the edge of the envelope. I had been carrying this envelope in my desk drawer for 4 years and 11 months, moving it from drawer to drawer, whenever I reorganized, never opening it, never throwing it away. Margaret had pressed it into Daniel's hands 2 weeks before she died, and asked him to give it to me when the time felt right. Daniel had given it to me at the funeral, quiet and without ceremony, and I had put it in my pocket and later put it in the drawer, and there it had stayed. For Arthur, it read in her handwriting, "Open when you're ready." I picked it up, turned it over in my hands. The seal was still intact. My throat tightened so sharply it hurt. I carried the envelope to the armchair in the corner, Margaret's armchair, and sat down. I didn't open it yet. I just held it and looked at her name in the return address corner, which she had written herself, and I let myself feel the full weight of missing her for the first time since the evening began. I had been carrying this envelope in my desk drawer for 5 years, moving it from drawer to drawer whenever I reorganized, never opening it, never throwing it away. I used to tell myself that was a coincidence. Sitting in that armchair, with her letter in both hands, and the lamp throwing a warm circle of light over everything, and the rest of the house dark and quiet around me, I was no longer sure the coincidences were something I believed in. I opened the envelope. She had used the good cream stationery, the kind she saved for things that mattered. 3 pages written in her hand, which had been slightly unsteady in the last months, but was still unmistakably hers. The letters were formed the way she had formed every letter for 60 years, careful, deliberate, each one fully committed to the page, like she'd considered it before setting it down. I started reading. Arthur, I've been trying to write this letter for 3 weeks, and I keep stopping because I can't figure out how to say it without sounding like I'm giving up. I'm not giving up. I just want to say some things clearly while I'm still clear enough to say them. My eyes burned. I blinked hard and kept going. You have always been the most patient man I know. Patient with business, patient with difficult people, patient with me when I was impossible. But I think sometimes your patience with Ethan has become something else. I think it has become a way of not seeing things you don't want to see. I know that's hard to read. I'm sorry. But I have a little time left, to be honest, and I'd rather spend it being honest with you than comfortable. My hands were trembling. I pressed the pages against my knees to hold them steady and made myself continue. Ethan has changed Arthur. Not all at once, that's the thing about this kind of change. It happens so gradually that you almost can't see it until it's already happened. But I've watched it. I've watched it for 2 years now. He stopped calling to talk. He started calling to ask. He comes to the house and his eyes move around the room like he's doing inventory. He asks questions about the trust that he frames as concern, but feel like something else. I can't name what it is exactly. I only know that when I look at my son now, I see a man who has learned to measure everything, including us. A sound escaped me, not quite a sob, but something close. Something from behind the sternum where you keep the things that are too heavy to carry to the surface. I pressed my fist against my mouth for a moment. I'm not saying he doesn't love you. I believe he does. I believe love and greed can live in the same person at the same time, and that's one of the saddest things I know. But I am saying, please, Arthur, don't wait too long. Don't be silent for so long that the silence becomes permission. You know what I mean? You've always known. I did know. That was the thing. I had known and chosen not to act on it over and over because acting on it meant admitting things I wasn't ready to admit. Margaret had been ready. She was always braver than me in the quiet ways. I asked Daniel to add something to the trust documentation. A protective clause. I won't explain all of it here. Daniel can do that better than I can, and in the right language. What I'll tell you is that I asked him to make sure that if Ethan ever causes you direct harm, financial, legal, or otherwise, there are consequences built into the structure of things. Not to punish him. I don't want to punish him. I want him to understand eventually that some things cannot be taken. They can only be earned or lost. My jaw ached from holding it tight. I relaxed it deliberately and took a slow breath through my nose. And Arthur, one more thing, because it's the most important, and I want to say it plainly. Whatever happens with Ethan, whatever he does or doesn't do, you are not alone. You have never been alone. You built something real in this world, not just money, not just a trust or a network or a name, but actual real things that you did for actual real people who will remember it. Victor Stone will remember it. Gerald will remember it. 100 people will remember it, who Ethan has never bothered to learn the names of. That is the legacy, Arthur, not the assets. The people. I love you. I have loved you since you were 31 years old, and completely impossible and absolutely worth it. Don't be too patient. But don't give up on him either. He is still our boy somewhere underneath everything he's become. Margaret. I sat with the letters in my lap for a long time. The lamp hummed softly. Outside, the wind had picked up, moving through the trees, the way October wind does in Connecticut, rattling the dry leaves that were still holding on. My face was wet. I hadn't noticed when that had started. I pressed the pages carefully flat with my palm, smoothing the folds, and I thought about my wife, about the woman who had spent her last weeks thinking not about herself, but about how to protect the man she was leaving behind. About the particular kind of love that doesn't make speeches, that just quietly does the work. You were the smarter one, I said out loud to the empty room to her. You always were. I set the letter on the side table and picked up my phone. It was past midnight. I had a meeting with Daniel in less than 8 hours. I called him anyway. He picked up on the first ring. You read it, he said. I read it, I said. My voice was rough and uneven, and I didn't try to fix it. She mentioned the protective clause. She said you'd explain it properly. Daniel, I stopped, gathered myself. Tell me what she asked you to do. All of it. Every detail. I need to hear it. A pause on his end. When he spoke again, his voice was careful and low. I'll tell you everything, he said. But Arthur, before I do, there's something else you need to hear first. My investigator called this morning. About Vanessa specifically. About what she has been doing for the past 3 years. Something shifted in my chest. Not quite dread, not quite readiness, but something in between. The feeling of standing at the edge of a high place and understanding that the next step commits you to the fall. Tell me, I said. Daniel's office always smelled like old paper and quiet authority. Not the kind of authority that announces itself, not marble lobbies or brass nameplates or receptionists trained to make you feel small before you've even sat down. Just the particular gravity of a room where consequential things had been decided for a very long time. Bookshelves floor to ceiling. A desk that had outlasted 3 sets of chairs. A window facing east that let in the kind of morning light that didn't flatter anything, which was, I had always thought, exactly right for a place where the truth was the primary product. I arrived at 10 minutes to 8. Daniel was already there, jacket off, sleeves rolled to the elbow, 2 mugs of coffee on the desk. He looked like a man who hadn't slept. He looked like a man who hadn't expected to sleep. Sit down, Arthur, he said, and his voice had the weight of someone who had been rehearsing this conversation since well before dawn. I sat. I wrapped both hands around the mug. The coffee was strong and bitter and exactly what I needed. How long have you had the investigator working? I asked. No preamble. We were past preamble. Daniel leaned back in his chair. 7 months, he said. I want you to understand I didn't go looking for trouble. I noticed the account irregularities first back in March. Small withdrawals patterns that didn't fit normal trust distributions. I flagged them internally, started monitoring. When the patterns got larger and more frequent, I brought in someone I trust. He paused. I should have told you sooner. I wanted to be certain before I said anything. I didn't want to hand you a suspicion, I wanted to hand you a file. He reached across the desk and placed a folder in front of me. Thick, tabbed with colored markers, each section labeled in Daniel's precise handwriting. Start with tab 3, he said. Tab 3 was a collection of screenshots, messages printed on standard paper, each one time-stamped, each one sourced. At the bottom of the first page, a note in Daniel's hand. Source: voluntary disclosure from James Whitfield, former college friend of Ethan Hayes, provided directly to investigator after witnessing content in shared group communication. I looked up at Daniel. James Whitfield, Ethan's roommate from Columbia. Former roommate, Daniel said. They had a falling out about 18 months ago. Whitfield says the friendship ended when Ethan stopped returning calls. He came forward because he said he couldn't keep it anymore. I looked back down at the first screenshot. The message was from Vanessa to Ethan, dated 22 months ago. You went to Greenwich again. I could tell from your mood when you got home. Ethan, every time you go back there, you come back smaller. I need you present. I need you here. My jaw tightened. I turned to the next page. Another message 3 months later. I'm not asking you to cut him off. I'm asking you to stop letting him set the terms of your relationship. He raised you, that doesn't mean he owns you. There's a difference between honoring your father and letting him define your ceiling. She didn't discourage him from seeing you, Daniel said, watching my face. She reframed who you were. In message after message over 3 years, she built a narrative that your presence made Ethan smaller, that your influence was a ceiling on his potential, that every time he came back to you, he was moving backward. I turned another page. My hands felt strange, too warm, too aware of themselves, the way hands feel right before they start shaking. Another message. This one shorter. If you can't decide whose life this is, Ethan, then maybe you're not ready for the life I'm trying to build with you. And one more 6 months before the engagement party. The older generation had their time. They built what they built. Now it's our turn. You don't explain yourself to them. You don't ask permission. You move forward and let them catch up if they can. I set the pages down on the desk. Carefully. The way you set down something fragile that you don't want to break before you've fully looked at it. 3 years, I said. My voice came out rough, scraped clean of everything except the fact of it. She spent 3 years teaching him to see me as an obstacle. Yes, Daniel said. He didn't soften it. He knew me well enough to know I didn't want it softened, and he let her. The words came out before I'd decided to say them, and once they were in the air between us, there was nothing to do but let them land. My chest ached with something I didn't have a clean name for, not anger, because anger would have been simpler. Something more like grief. The particular grief of watching a person you love become someone you don't recognize, and understanding that the transformation didn't happen to them. They walked toward it, one small step at a time. Arthur, Daniel's voice dropped. I want to be careful here because I don't want to put words in your mouth about your son's intentions. What I can tell you is what the evidence shows. What I can't tell you is how much of this was Vanessa's design and how much was his choice, I said. You can say it, Daniel. I'm 69 years old. I can hear hard things. Daniel pressed his lips together and nodded. What I can say with confidence is that he never pushed back. Not once in 3 years in any of the communications we've seen. Every time she drew a line between you and him, he stood on her side of it. He looked at me steadily. Whether that's weakness or intention, I genuinely don't know yet. I stared at the pile of printed messages on Daniel's desk. 22 months of careful, methodical work. A woman who had looked at my son and seen not a person to love, but a position to occupy. A son who had looked at his father and seen what? An obstacle, a ceiling. Or simply something so familiar it had become invisible. I picked up the coffee mug, set it back down without drinking. My throat had closed in a way that made swallowing feel like work. What's in the other tabs? I asked. Daniel straightened. Something shifted in his posture, a slight bracing the way a person braces when they're about to deliver the second blow in a sequence. That, he said, is where it gets worse. He reached across and turned to tab 5. Arthur, I need you to understand that what Vanessa has been doing in the past 3 years was not preparation for a marriage. It was preparation for a transaction. And the engagement party, the guest list, the venue, the timing. He paused. None of it was what you thought it was. My stomach dropped cold and sudden like a floor giving way. Then tell me, I said, what it actually was. Daniel opened the second folder, the way a surgeon opens a chest, with the particular deliberateness of someone who understands that what comes next cannot be undone once it's been seen. Tab 5 was a timeline. Dates in the left column, events in the center, source, notes on the right. It stretched back 18 months, 8 months before anyone had mentioned an engagement a year before the party I'd attended last night. "Walk me through it," I said. My voice was level. I had decided somewhere on the drive in from Greenwich that morning that I was going to stay level. That whatever came through that door, I was going to let it in without flinching, because flinching had never once helped me understand anything. Daniel settled his reading glasses on his nose and began. 14 months ago, he said, Ethan retained a law firm, not mine, a boutique firm in Midtown that specializes in estate restructuring. He told them he was looking to formalize his financial independence from a family trust. He framed it as estate planning. Routine. Daniel's finger moved down the timeline. The firm drafted a series of documents. First, a petition to transfer the Greenwich property, your home Arthur, into Ethan's name outright. Second, a restructuring of the brokerage accounts to remove the trust classification and place them under his sole ownership. Third, and this is the one that should concern you most, he looked up over his glasses, a modification to the beneficiary designations on 3 life insurance policies that you hold, changing the primary beneficiary from the Margaret Hayes Community Fund designation you set up 2 years ago to Vanessa Miller Hayes. My hands went cold. Completely suddenly cold, the way hands go cold when the blood decides it needs to be somewhere else. That last one, I said carefully, requires my signature. It does, Daniel said, which is why it hasn't happened yet. But Arthur, the document was drafted. The process was mapped. The only thing standing between that document and your signature was the question of how to get you to sign it. He took his glasses off and set them on the desk. Or how to remove the need for your signature entirely. The room got very quiet around those words. The guardianship, I said. The word felt strange in my mouth, clinical and cold like a diagnosis you've been dreading. The guardianship, Daniel confirmed. If a court were to determine that you lacked the capacity to manage your own affairs, financial or otherwise, a guardian would be appointed to act in your place. In the petition they've been preparing, the proposed guardian is Ethan himself. He paused, and his voice dropped half a register. With Vanessa as co-guardian. I stood up from the chair. Not in anger, my legs simply needed to be under me for this part. I walked to the window and looked out at Midtown in the early morning light. Cabs below. People with coffee cups walking fast, going places. The absolute ordinary relentlessness of the city. They were going to have me declared incompetent. I said to the window, to the city, to whatever version of myself was still capable of processing this sentence without the floor tilting under it. They were building the case for it, Daniel said from behind me. The documents aren't filed, but they exist. And the medical records, Arthur, turn around. You need to hear this part face to face. I turned around. Daniel's expression was the one I had seen only a few times in 20 years of working together. The expression of a man who cared personally about what he was about to say professionally. Someone accessed your medical records, he said. Not illegally, through a physician who apparently agreed to conduct an informal review and provide a written opinion. The opinion as drafted suggests early-stage cognitive concerns, difficulty with complex decision-making, possible early indicators of decline. He leaned forward. Arthur, you have had a full neurological workup every 2 years since you turned 60. Your last one was 8 months ago. You are, as your physician told you in writing, in excellent cognitive health for your age. Then the opinion is fabricated, I said. My voice came out flat and final like a door closing. The opinion, Daniel said carefully, is a document that was designed to support a predetermined conclusion. Whether the physician involved was negligent or complicit, I don't yet know. But yes, it does not reflect your actual medical status. I walked back to the chair and sat down. My legs felt strange. Not weak, just deeply structurally tired, the way structural things get tired after they've been holding weight for too long, without anyone noticing. Ethan designed this, I said. Not a question, a reckoning. The originating instructions came from Ethan, Daniel said. Vanessa executed a significant portion of the operational planning. But the strategy, the sequence of steps, the financial restructuring first, then the guardianship, then the beneficiary changes, that architecture belongs to your son. I looked at the desk surface between us. The folders, the tabs, 23 pages about a ring, 3 years of messages, 18 months of legal preparation, a fabricated medical opinion. My son had spent a year and a half building a machine whose sole purpose was to take everything I had ever built and reclassify it as his. Not through conversation, not through honesty, through paperwork and procedure and the slow, patient dismantling of my legal standing. And he had done it while calling me on holidays and asking after my health. The pain that moved through my chest then was unlike anything I had felt since Margaret died. Not sharp, not sudden. Slow and total, the way cold water rises, filling every space, leaving no room for anything else. Daniel. My voice came out very quiet. What do we need to do not to punish anyone, not to retaliate? What do we need to do to stop this? Daniel straightened. And for the first time since I'd walked in, something shifted in his expression, from the gravity of delivering bad news to the particular steadiness of a man who has already been thinking about the answer. We move first, he said, on every front simultaneously. The medical records, the trust, accounts, the property. And one more thing, Arthur. Something that will require a conversation you may not be expecting. He folded his hands on the desk. There's a shareholder meeting next month, and I believe it's time for Victor Stone to tell certain people certain things they should have known a long time ago. Before I could respond, my phone vibrated against the desk surface. An unknown number. I looked at Daniel. He shook his head slightly. He didn't recognize it either. I picked up. Mr. Hayes. A woman's voice. Careful. Low. The voice of someone speaking from inside a situation they were afraid of. My name isn't important right now, but I work for your son's accounting firm. And there is something you need to know about who actually designed the plan you're currently sitting across from a lawyer discussing. Every nerve in my body went absolutely still. Go on, I said. Before I tell you what Daniel laid out on that table, the truth about that engagement party that made my blood run cold, I need to know you're still with me. Drop the number 9 in the comments right now. Just a 9. That's all. Because what you're about to hear changes everything you thought you knew about that night. A gentle reminder: parts of this story include fictional elements crafted to carry a deeper message. If that's not something you'd like to continue with, this is a good moment to step away, no hard feelings at all. I set the phone down on Daniel's desk and looked at it for a moment. The way you look at something that has just changed the temperature of a room without making a sound. She'll meet me, I said. 2 hours. There's a coffee place on 49th, she mentioned. I looked up at Daniel. But first you said there was something about the engagement party itself, about why they chose that night. Daniel had been watching me since the call ended. Now he walked to the window, and stood with his back to the city for a moment, before turning around. It was an unusual gesture for him. Daniel Brooks was not a man who needed to collect himself before speaking. The fact that he did it told me everything about what was coming. Sit down, Arthur, he said. Not the way you say it when someone needs rest. The way you say it when someone needs a fixed point. I sat. Daniel returned to his desk. He didn't open another folder. He just looked at me directly, forearms on the desk, and said, the party was a setup. The invitation, the venue, the guest list, the seating arrangement, the timing of what Vanessa said to you, all of it was designed with one specific purpose: to make you lose control in a room full of witnesses. The air in my lungs went very still. There were 2 people in that room last night. Daniel continued, his voice dropping to the register he used when he needed every word to land cleanly, who were not there as guests. They were positioned at opposite ends of the dining room, with their phones already recording. The camera angles were set to capture your seat specifically. He paused. If you had raised your voice, if you had stood up too quickly, knocked something over, made any gesture that could be characterized as erratic or aggressive, they would have had it on video before you reached the door. I felt the cold start somewhere at the base of my spine and move upward slow and thorough, the way cold moves when it's serious. The plan, Daniel said, was to use that footage in the guardianship petition. Not as the sole evidence. The fabricated medical opinion was already prepared, as I told you. But a video of Arthur Hayes visibly losing control in a public setting, combined with a physician's written assessment of cognitive decline, would have given any reasonable judge cause to at least open proceedings. He let that sit for a moment. And once proceedings open, Arthur, the burden shifts. You would have been defending your own competence in court, while they managed your assets as proposed temporary guardians. My hands were flat on my thighs. I pressed them down hard and felt my own pulse against my palms. I walked out, I said. I straightened my jacket and I walked out. You did, Daniel said. And something moved across his face, not quite relief, not quite admiration, but a quality of feeling that was close to both. Arthur, in 30 years of practicing law, I have watched a great many people respond to provocation. What you did last night, the restraint, the composure, walking out of that room without a single word that could have been used against you, that saved you. Not strategy, not preparation, just the way you are. I looked at the desk surface between us. I thought about Vanessa standing up in that room. I thought about the deliberate, practiced calm of her voice when she said my name. I thought about the two people sitting in the corners of a dining room with phones pointed at a 69-year-old man eating dinner at his son's engagement party. My chest felt tight in a way that had nothing to do with my heart rate. It was the tightness of something being understood fully, and finally, after years of being only half seen. She knew I wouldn't cause a scene, I said. She'd watched me long enough to know that I don't operate that way. So why set the trap at all? Because she needed to be certain, Daniel said. And because even a 1% chance was worth eliminating if the alternative was leaving you in full control of the trust. He straightened a pen on his desk, a small automatic gesture of a man thinking carefully. There's also another possibility. If the trap had worked, if you'd reacted, everything would have accelerated. The guardianship petition would have been filed within the week. The asset transfers would have followed. The entire plan would have been executed before you'd had time to understand what was happening. And since it didn't work, I said. Since it didn't work, Daniel said, they lost the accelerant. They still have the medical opinion. They still have the petition drafted. But without the video, the case is significantly weaker. And in the time they lost last night, we gained this morning. I breathed out slowly. The kind of breath that has weight to it, that carries something out of the body that needed to go. How long before they realized the trap failed and adjust? I asked. They probably realized it last night, Daniel said, which means the clock is running. He looked at me steadily. Go meet your accountant. Come back with whatever she gives you. Then we'll talk about next steps. A beat. And Arthur, when you leave this building, don't use your regular car service. Walk. Get a cab on the street. Don't use your phone for anything that isn't essential until we understand how much of your communication they may have been monitoring. That sentence landed in a particularly cold way. I stood, put on my coat, picked up my phone, and for the first time in years, looked at it as something other than a tool. Daniel. I stopped at the door. The medical opinion. The physician who wrote it, do we know who it was? We're close, Daniel said. By end of day, I expect to have a name. His jaw set. When I do, I'll have a conversation with the relevant licensing board. Quietly, but clearly. I nodded once and walked out. In the elevator, I thought about what Daniel had said, that my restraint had saved me, that the way I was had been the thing that protected me when nothing else could have. I thought about Margaret's letter. Don't be silent for too long. She hadn't meant don't be composed. She had meant don't be invisible. There was a difference. I was only now learning to feel where the line was. Outside, I stepped onto the sidewalk and flagged a cab heading uptown. 2 blocks north, my phone buzzed. The same unknown number. The woman's voice was low and quick. "I've been parked across the street from that building since 7 this morning," she said before I could speak. "I needed to be sure you were actually here before I called. I couldn't risk leaving a message." "There's a coffee place on 49th and 8th, she said. "Sienna's. I'm already here. Corner table back left. Please don't be long, Mr. Hayes. I don't have much time." 10 minutes, I said, and got in the cab. Sienna's Coffee was the kind of place that existed in every midtown block, narrow, slightly too warm, smelling of espresso and someone else's morning. The kind of place where nobody looked up from their laptops long enough to notice who was sitting at the corner table in the back. She was already there when I walked in. A woman in her early 40s, dark hair pulled back, wearing a gray coat that she hadn't taken off despite the warmth of the room. Both hands were wrapped around a cup she hadn't touched. Her eyes found me the moment I came through the door. The eyes of someone who had been watching that entrance for 20 minutes, rehearsing the moment, telling herself she wouldn't change her mind. I sat down across from her. I didn't offer my hand. She didn't offer hers. "Thank you for coming," she said. Her voice was steadier than I expected, controlled, the voice of a person who was frightened but had decided that being frightened wasn't going to stop her. "Thank you for calling," I said. She looked around the room once, a quick, practiced scan, then back at me. "My name isn't something I'm going to give you today," she said. "I hope you'll understand why. I've worked for Ethan's firm for 4 years. I'm a senior accountant. I have access to things that senior accountants have access to, and in 4 years I have seen things I told myself weren't my business." Her jaw tightened. I was wrong about that. "What changed?" I asked. Something moved across her face, not quite pain, not quite anger. The expression of a person who has been carrying something too heavy for too long and has finally found someone to put it down in front of. "The medical file," she said. 3 weeks ago, I processed an unusual payment. Consulting fee categorized under legal expenses. The recipient was a physician I'd never heard of, not affiliated with any hospital network I recognized. The amount was small enough not to trigger automatic review, but large enough to make me curious. Her fingers tightened around the untouched coffee cup. I pulled the corresponding documentation. What I found was not a legal consultation. It was a written assessment, a medical opinion stating that a 69-year-old individual showed signs of cognitive decline. The individual wasn't named in the document I saw, but the trust reference number in the attached memo was one I recognized. She looked at me directly. "It was yours, Mr. Hayes." I kept my face even. My chest was doing something complicated behind my ribs, but my face stayed even. "Go on," I said. "I told myself it was a coincidence," she said, and her voice cracked slightly on the word. She cleared her throat hard. "I told myself there were 100 explanations. Then I started looking at the broader file structure, things I had partial access to through the accounting system, and I found the trust restructuring documents, the beneficiary change proposals, the draft petition." She pressed her lips together, and her eyes went bright. "Mr. Hayes, I have a father. He's 64 years old. He lives in Pennsylvania, and he calls me every Sunday morning, and sometimes I'm too busy to answer." Her voice dropped. "I answered this week." My throat tightened. I said nothing. I let her have the moment. She pulled herself back together with a visible effort, shoulders drawing up, jaw setting, eyes clearing. "The thing you need to understand," she said, her voice regaining its precision, "is that none of this originated with Vanessa. That's the part that matters most. That's the part I couldn't keep to myself." I leaned forward slightly, my elbows on the table, my hands folded in front of me. "Explain that," I said quietly. "Ethan came to me 2 years ago," she said. "Not as my employer asking an accounting question. As a man who wanted to understand something very specific. He asked me to pull the historical records for the Hayes Family Trust, going back 20 years. He asked me to identify every account, every asset classification, every access point." She looked at me steadily. "He spent 6 weeks studying those records. 6 weeks of questions. Every time he came back, the questions were more precise, more targeted." Her voice dropped. "He wasn't confused about what he owned and what he didn't. He knew exactly where the lines were. He was mapping out how to move them. The pain that moved through me then was different from anything I'd felt in the previous 12 hours. Not cold, not tight, not the physical sensation of shock, just vast. The way open sky is vast, too much to hold in one place, filling the entire field of vision. "When did Vanessa enter the picture?" I asked. My voice was perfectly level. I didn't know how, but it was. 8 months after Ethan started studying the trust records, she said. He'd already done the work before she arrived. When she came along, she paused, choosing her words carefully. He recognized someone who wanted the same things he did, not someone who convinced him, someone who confirmed him. She looked down at her coffee. "She is not innocent. Please don't misunderstand me. She drove the execution. The 10 messages, the social engineering, the medical opinion, that was her operational work. But the blueprint," she looked back up. "The blueprint was his." I sat with that. I let it be true, which was the only thing left to do with it. "Do you have documentation?" I asked. She reached into her coat pocket and placed a small USB drive on the table between us. Black plain, the kind you could buy at any drugstore. She didn't slide it toward me. She just set it down. "Everything I could access legally is on that drive," she said. "Internal memos, payment records, the accounting queries Ethan ran over those 6 weeks with timestamps. A copy of the medical opinion draft with the associated payment trail." She looked at me with eyes that had steadied into something resolute and a little exhausted. "I don't know what you're going to do with it. That's not my responsibility. My responsibility was to make sure the right person had it." Her voice softened slightly. "He's your son, Mr. Hayes. I'm sorry. I'm genuinely sorry." My hand moved to the USB drive. I picked it up. It weighed almost nothing. Less than nothing. And yet my fingers registered it the way fingers register something that changes the weight of everything around it. "Thank you," I said. And I meant it in a way that didn't need any additional words. She stood, gathered her coat around her, and looked at me one final time. "I'd appreciate it if my name stayed out of whatever happens next for as long as possible," she said. "I have a lawyer. I know my rights. But I'd still appreciate it." "You have my word," I said. She nodded once and walked out through the front door without looking back. I watched her go. Then I looked down at the USB drive in my palm. I thought about my son at 30 years old, pulling up trust records on a computer screen, studying the lines of an empire he had decided should belong to him. Planning. Mapping. Waiting. I thought about Margaret's letter. He is still our boy somewhere underneath everything he's become. I wanted to believe that. I was trying very hard to believe that. I took out my phone and called Daniel. "I have something," I said the moment he answered. "And Daniel, after you look at it, I need us to start talking about the shareholder meeting next month. Because I think it's time." Victor Stone stood up in a room, and told the truth about a few things that have been quiet for far too long. The drive back to Greenwich took longer than usual. Not because of traffic, the Saturday afternoon roads were clear enough, but because I kept finding myself slowing down without meaning to, my foot easing off the accelerator, as though some part of my body understood that arriving home meant sitting alone with everything I now knew and wanted a few more miles before that happened. By the time I pulled into the driveway, the October light had gone flat and gray, the kind of afternoon that doesn't commit to anything. I sat in the car for a moment with the engine off. The house looked the same as it always looked. Same curtains, same porch light on its timer, same silence. I went inside and spread everything across the dining room table. The USB drive from the accountant, the printed dossier from Daniel's folders, the account irregularities, the trust withdrawal records, the tab with Vanessa's messages. Margaret's letter still folded the way I'd refolded it last night. And beneath all of it, a single thread I could finally see clearly for the first time, a thread that connected every piece of what I'd learned in the past 18 hours into one coherent, undeniable picture. I stood at the head of the table and looked at it all and felt something happen in my chest that I hadn't expected. Not more pain, not anger. Something closer to clarity, the particular almost physical sensation of a complicated thing becoming simple. I picked up Margaret's letter and read the last paragraph again. I asked Daniel to add something to the trust documentation. A protective clause. Whatever happens, make sure the family's real values are protected. I set the letter down and called Daniel. He picked up on the first ring. "You're home," he said. "I'm home," I said. Daniel, Margaret's letter, the last section. She mentioned the protective clause specifically. She said you'd explain it better than she could, and in the right language. My voice came out steadier than I felt. "I need you to tell me everything she asked you to do, not the summary. Everything." A breath on his end. Then she called me in April of 2020, 4 months before she passed. She came to the office alone, didn't tell you she was coming, asked me not to mention it until she said so. His voice softened in a way that Daniel Brooks almost never allowed his voice to soften. She sat in the chair across from my desk, and she said, "Daniel, I need to do something for Arthur that he won't do for himself, because he still believes the best about everyone, and I'm running out of time to protect that about him." My throat closed so fast it hurt. "What did she ask for?" I managed. "A conditional inheritance clause," Daniel said. "Specifically, she wanted a provision added to the trust documentation stating that if Ethan Hayes engaged in any action that caused direct harm to Arthur Hayes, financial, legal, or reputational, Ethan's status as a beneficiary would be automatically suspended. Not removed permanently. Suspended pending review." Daniel paused. She was careful about that word. Suspended, not eliminated. She told me, "I don't want to punish him. I want him to have a reason to stop before it's too late." I pressed my hand flat against the dining room table. The wood was cool under my palm. I needed something solid. "She knew," I said. My voice cracked on the second word just slightly, and I didn't try to smooth it over. "She knew all of this was coming, and she didn't tell me because she knew I wouldn't believe it." "She knew you needed to see it yourself," Daniel said gently. Her exact words were, "Arthur has to arrive at the truth on his own. If I hand it to him, he'll spend his energy defending Ethan instead of protecting himself." She knew you, Arthur. She knew you better than anyone. The tears came then, not loudly, not in the way that demands attention, just quietly and completely, the way rain comes when it has been threatening all day. I didn't try to stop them. There are moments when stopping them is a kind of dishonesty, and I had used up my tolerance for dishonesty in the last 24 hours. "The condition," I said, when I could speak evenly again. "Has it been triggered?" "Yes," Daniel said. The night of October 10th. In a restaurant on the Upper East Side in front of approximately 60 witnesses, Ethan Hayes stood by while his fiancée directed his father, Castrion, to leave a private event. He verbally supported that direction. A pause. That constitutes direct reputational harm under the language Margaret specified. The clause was triggered the moment he spoke. I wiped my face with the back of my hand and looked at Margaret's photograph on the dining room shelf. The one from Maine. Her laughing face, the summer light. She was always the smarter one, I said, out loud to her, to the room, to whatever remained of 40 years of a life built together. She was extraordinary, Daniel said quietly and without qualification. I gathered myself, set my shoulders back. The grief was real and I wasn't going to pretend it wasn't. But there was work to be done and Margaret had left me the tools to do it. The least I could do was use them. One more thing, I said. I'm going to call Victor Stone. I think it's time for a conversation I should have had a long time ago. I looked at the USB drive on the table. And Daniel, tomorrow I want you to look at everything on that drive. All of it. Tell me what we have and what we need. I'll be in the office at 7, he said. I ended the call. I stood at the table for a moment longer, looking at the assembled evidence of a betrayal that had been built slowly and carefully over 2 years by people I had loved and trusted. Then I picked up my phone and called Victor Stone. He answered in 2 rings. Arthur. His voice warmed immediately, the voice of a man who had been hoping for this call. Victor, I said, are you free sometime next week? There are some things I'd like to discuss in person. A brief sound, not quite a laugh, something more like relief given voice. For you, Arthur, he said, I've been free since Friday night. Just tell me when. Victor's office was everything mine never was. 40 floors up, floor-to-ceiling glass on 3 sides. The kind of view that makes Manhattan look like something that can be held and turned over in your hands. Clean lines, expensive silence. A desk that probably cost more than my first car. The whole space had the particular quality of a room designed to remind everyone who entered it exactly who they were dealing with. When I walked in on Monday morning, Victor stood up. Not a half-rise, not the polite lean forward that executives use when they want to acknowledge someone without fully committing to the gesture. He stood up completely, came around from behind the desk, and extended his hand, the way men used to extend hands with the full weight of what they meant behind it. Thank you for coming, he said, and gripped my hand hard. Sit wherever you're comfortable. I chose the chair facing the window. I had always preferred to look at the thing directly rather than have it behind me. Victor's assistant set coffee on the low table between us and disappeared without being asked. Victor settled into the chair across from me, no desk between us, no performance of hierarchy. Just 2 men in a room with something important between them. I've been making calls, Victor said, leaning forward with his elbows on his knees, his voice dropping to the register of a man speaking without audience. Since Saturday. Quietly. I wanted to understand the full shape of what Ethan and Vanessa have been building before I sat down with you. He looked at me directly, his jaw tight. Arthur, I want you to understand something before we go any further. Whatever you need from me, resources, testimony, presence at any meeting or proceeding, it's yours. Without condition and without limit. I owe you a debt I've never properly paid, and I am not going to sit on the sidelines while someone tries to dismantle what you built. My chest tightened with something warm and unwelcome. At the same time, the particular vulnerability of being cared for when you have spent 69 years being the one who does the caring. I appreciate that more than I can say, I said. But what I need from you isn't loyalty, Victor. What I need is information, and then a decision. He nodded once. Then let's start with the information. He reached for a folder on the side table, slim, unmarked, and opened it on his knee. 25 years ago, he said, when the Stone Group was still small enough that I knew every employee by name, you and I signed an equity participation agreement. You remember it. I remember signing something, I said carefully. I'll be honest, the details have gone dim. I left active management of most of my investment positions around that time. Daniel handled the ongoing oversight. The agreement, Victor said, gave your family trust a 30% equity participation in the Stone Group's future growth above a certain threshold. In plain language, once my company surpassed a specific valuation, a portion of the growth equity would be attributed to your trust as a beneficial interest. He looked at me steadily. Over 25 years with the company growing the way it has, that interest has compounded. A pause, deliberate and careful. The current attributed value of your trust's beneficial interest in the Stone Group is approximately 40% of our total equity structure. The number landed in the room and stayed there. 40%, I said. 40%, Victor confirmed. His voice was level, but his eyes were intent, watching me process it, the way a man watches someone receive news that will change how they see everything they've been looking at. On paper, those shares are held under a nominee arrangement, my name as trustee for the investment entity. Your trust is the beneficial owner. The structure was designed to be quiet, and it was housed inside a separate holding vehicle that predates your current trust structure by 8 years, which is why it never appeared in the account records Daniel reviewed. It existed entirely outside his line of sight. That was deliberate, and it was my doing, not yours. I should have surfaced it long ago. We were both younger, and I had reasons at the time for not wanting the equity distribution to be public knowledge while the company was still establishing itself. He exhaled slowly. I should have flagged it with you formally years ago. I didn't. That's on me. I looked out at the Manhattan skyline behind him. 40 floors of glass between us and the city, and somewhere below in a building I could probably see from here, my son was sitting in an office built on a foundation he had never bothered to understand. Ethan doesn't know this exists, I said. Ethan has never asked, Victor said. The entity name under which the nominee arrangement is held doesn't appear in the trust records he reviewed because it predates the current trust structure by 8 years. It's a separate investment vehicle. His expression hardened slightly. He spent 6 weeks studying your assets, Arthur. He found what he was looking for and stopped looking. He didn't look far enough. Something shifted in my chest, not satisfaction, because this wasn't a moment for satisfaction, but a particular kind of steadiness. The feeling of standing on ground that is more solid than you realized. Victor, I said, if I were to exercise the beneficial ownership rights in that agreement publicly, formally, in the context of a shareholder meeting, what would that mean for Ethan's current position? Victor set the folder down. He looked at me for a moment, with an expression I recognized, the expression of a man who has already worked through all the implications and is now waiting to see if the other person is ready to hear them. It would mean, he said slowly, that the investment architecture Ethan has been using as collateral for his expansion plans, the deals he's been promising investors, the development projects he's been financing against projected equity. A significant portion of that architecture rests on assets that don't legally belong to him. And in a shareholder meeting with documentation presented formally and publicly, that becomes something no investor in the room can ignore. He leaned back slightly. It doesn't destroy him outright, but it pulls the floor out from under the version of himself he's been selling. I nodded. My hands were steady on the arms of the chair. There's one more thing, Victor said. His voice shifted, became more careful. The medical file, the guardianship petition they've been preparing. I have a contact, a federal judge who owes me a conversation. If we can get the fabricated medical opinion in front of the right eyes before Ethan files, we can preempt the petition entirely. But the timing matters. He looked at me with the eyes of a man who understood urgency without dramatizing it. How long before their next move, do you think? Daniel believes they know the trap failed, I said, which means they're already adjusting. Victor reached into his jacket pocket and took out his phone, checked the date, and set it face down on the table between us. The Stone Group's quarterly shareholder meeting is scheduled for the last week of October. That gives us roughly 12 days to get everything in position. His eyes met mine. 12 days, Arthur. Is that enough? I thought about Margaret. I thought about 40 years of decisions made carefully and without drama. I thought about a dining room table covered in evidence that should have broken me and hadn't. It's enough, I said. 12 days doesn't sound like much. But I have learned over the course of a long life that the most significant things rarely require more time than that. They only require the right decisions made in the right sequence by people who have stopped second-guessing themselves. The first call I made on Sunday morning was to Dr. Raymond Holt. Raymond had been my physician for 15 years, a quiet, meticulous man in his mid-60s who ran a private practice on the Upper West Side, and who believed with the conviction of someone who had seen too many patients die from things that could have been caught earlier, that documentation was the most important tool in medicine. He had administered my neurological workups every 2 years since I turned 60. He knew the inside of my health the way Daniel knew the inside of my finances completely, and with the particular care of a person who understood that the details mattered. He answered on the third ring. Arthur, he said with the warmth of a man who had genuinely missed a patient he liked. It's been a few months. Are you well? I'm well, I said. But I need to see you tomorrow morning, early, and I need to ask you something before I explain why. Go ahead, he said. No hesitation. Raymond was not a man who needed preamble. Has anyone contacted you in the past 3 months? I said carefully, requesting access to my medical records or asking for any kind of informal assessment of my cognitive health. A pause, short but specific. The pause of a man who is choosing between professional discretion and personal loyalty and arriving at his answer. No, Raymond said firmly. No one has contacted me, and if anyone had Arthur, they would have heard from my attorney before they heard another word from me. A beat. Why are you asking? Because someone produced a written medical opinion suggesting I show signs of cognitive decline, I said. It wasn't based on my actual records. It wasn't produced by anyone who has ever examined me, and it was commissioned by people who plan to use it in a legal proceeding. The sound Raymond made was not a word. It was the sound a man makes when something he has dedicated his life to has been used as a weapon. Come in tomorrow at 7, he said. I'll have everything pulled before you arrive. I thanked him and ended the call. Then I called Daniel. Raymond Holt is expecting us tomorrow morning, I said. We're going to build the counter record. Everything, the neurological workups, the annual physicals, the cognitive assessments. Every piece of documentation that shows my actual medical status over the past decade. Good, Daniel said, and his voice had the particular crispness of a man who had been waiting for this specific call. I'll have the legal brief drafted by Tuesday. We'll file a declaratory judgment request with the court. It's a preemptive move that formally places your competency on record before Ethan has a chance to contest it. Once it's filed, any guardianship petition they submit will be fighting uphill against documented evidence already in the court record. And the physician who produced the false opinion, I asked. I've identified him, Daniel said. A retired internist in New Jersey license currently under review for unrelated billing issues. I've prepared a formal complaint to the state medical board. It goes out Wednesday. I also have enough documentation to refer the matter to the county prosecutor's office file for potential fraud charges. His voice hardened slightly. Fabricating medical records for use in a legal proceeding is a felony in New Jersey, Arthur. The man made a serious mistake. Send the complaint, I said, but quietly. I don't want Ethan to know we've moved until we're ready for him to know. Understood, Daniel said. What else? The trust accounts, I said. The 7 accounts Ethan has been drawing from without authorization. I want formal demand letters prepared and ready. Not sent yet. Ready. And Daniel pull the equity participation agreement with Victor Stone. All of it. Every page, every amendment, every notation. I want it clean and verified and ready to be presented in a shareholder meeting. I'll have it by Thursday, Daniel said. Those 12 days had a texture to them that I still remember clearly, not the texture of waiting, but the texture of building. Each morning I drove to Daniel's office or to Raymond's clinic or sat at my own desk in Greenwich, working through documents that had accumulated over decades and now needed to be understood completely in a way I had never needed to understand them before. Raymond was meticulous and quietly furious on my behalf, the contained fury of a professional whose work had been counterfeited. He prepared a comprehensive medical file that was, as he put it, with clipped precision, the most thoroughly documented assessment of cognitive health I have produced in 30 years of practice. He signed every page himself. He had it notarized the same day. If anyone tries to question your mental capacity in a court of law, he told me, leaning across his desk with an expression I had never seen on his careful face before, something fierce and protective, they will be doing so against this record, and I will testify in person if it comes to that. My eyes went hot at that. I blinked it back and shook his hand and thanked him in the only way I knew how, simply and directly, without making more of it than it was. On the 10th day, I sat with Daniel in his office and looked at the complete assembled file. Everything in its place. Every account documented. Every legal brief prepared. The equity participation agreement clean and verified. Raymond's medical record. The complaint to the medical board sent and acknowledged. Victor briefed and ready. Is there anything we've missed? I asked. Daniel looked at the file for a long moment. Then he looked at me. No, he said. There isn't. I nodded. My hands were steady on the desk. My chest felt the particular lightness of a man who has finished carrying something heavy and set it down properly for the first time. That night I sat in Margaret's armchair in Greenwich and said nothing to her photograph. I simply sat with her. After everything, the calls, the documents, the 12 days of careful, deliberate work, I needed a moment that didn't require anything from me except to be present. The next morning, I put on my old charcoal suit. The one she always said made me look like a man who had already said everything worth saying and meant every word of it. I picked up my briefcase, walked to the door, and stopped. My phone had buzzed. A text from Ethan Dad. I heard there's a shareholder meeting today at the Stone Group building. Are you going to be there? I read it twice. Turned the phone face down in my coat pocket without replying. The answer to that question was going to arrive in a conference room on the 48th floor of a building in Midtown Manhattan. And it was going to arrive in a language that didn't require a text message. The elevator rose in silence. 48 floors. I counted them the way I used to count my breaths before making decisions that couldn't be undone, not to track the number, but to give my mind something steady to hold on to while the rest of me adjusted to what was coming. The building was one of those midtown towers that had been designed specifically to make the people inside it feel significant. All glass and steel and the kind of vertical ambition that announces itself from 3 blocks away. Ethan had closed his first major deal using this building's address as collateral. I remembered him telling me that, proud of it, the way young men are proud of borrowed credibility they mistake for their own. The elevator opened onto the 48th floor. A long hallway carpeted in dark gray, with the muted sound of a room full of people doing the controlled, careful work of appearing confident. I gave my name to the woman at the reception desk. She checked her list, checked it again, with a slight hesitation that she covered professionally, and handed me a visitor badge. The meeting has already begun, she said. About 10 minutes ago. That's fine, I said. I'll find my way. I opened the door to the conference room quietly. The room was exactly what I had expected, floor-to-ceiling glass on the far wall, the Manhattan skyline doing its work in the background, a long oval table that seated 40 people and was nearly full. A large screen at the front displayed a slide deck with clean fonts and carefully chosen numbers. And at the head of the table, moving through his presentation, with the ease of a man who has done this many times and intends to do it many more, my son. Ethan was good at this. I want to be honest about that because I think it matters to be honest about the things that are true even when they complicate the story. He moved through the figures with precision and confidence, his voice carrying the right weight in the right places, his hands making the small gestures that communicate competence without demanding attention. He had learned these things somewhere from watching, from practicing, from the years of work that were genuinely his own, even when the foundation beneath them wasn't. I chose a seat in this back row, 2 chairs from the end. Nobody turned around. I looked at the room. The faces around the table, investors, executives, a handful of analysts with their laptops open. And in the far corner, completely still, a navy suit, silver hair, hands resting flat on the table, Victor Stone. He hadn't moved since I came in, but his eyes found mine the moment I sat down, the way a man's eyes find the thing he's been watching for, and he gave me a single, small nod. I looked back at my son. Ethan was talking about expansion. A new development corridor in New Jersey projected returns over 5 years, partnership structures that would bring in 3 additional institutional investors. The numbers were compelling. The vision was coherent. And almost none of the foundation it rested on actually belonged to him in the way he believed it did. That was the thing that sat in my chest as I watched him. Not anger, I had moved through the anger in the 12 days between this moment and that Friday night in October. What remained was something more complicated and more permanent. The grief of watching someone you raised become genuinely skilled at something, and knowing that the skill had been used in service of something that would eventually cost them everything. I thought of Ethan at 12 years old, sitting at the kitchen table in Greenwich, with a notebook writing down everything I said about my investment decisions that day. He had asked questions for 2 hours. Smart questions. The kind that told me he was actually listening, not just appearing to. I had gone to bed that night thinking that whatever came next for this boy, he was going to be all right. The memory pressed against the back of my eyes with a heat I hadn't expected. I blinked it down and kept my face even. Vanessa was seated at the front 2 chairs to Ethan's left. She held a pen she wasn't using and watched the room, the way she always watched rooms, not listening so much as auditing her eyes, moving from face to face with the efficiency of someone taking attendance. When her gaze reached the back row, it moved past me and then came back. I watched the moment she recognized me. It was a very small thing, a fraction of a second, a barely perceptible change in the set of her jaw, a brightness that went out of her eyes as quickly as it had been there. She didn't move. She didn't speak. But the pen in her hand pressed down against the notepad with a force that left a mark, and the color in her cheeks shifted from composed to effortful in a way that no one else in the room would have noticed. I held her gaze for exactly as long as necessary. Then I looked back at the screen. Ethan was moving to the signing portion of the agenda. The language was smooth, the transition practiced the kind of moment that had been choreographed to feel inevitable. Before we move to the execution phase, Ethan said, his voice carrying the room easily, I'd like to open the floor for any final questions or comments from our stakeholders. The room held the brief, comfortable quiet of a meeting that expects no surprises. And then Victor Stone placed both hands flat on the table and stood up. The room reoriented toward him, the way rooms reorient toward gravity, not all at once, but progressively, each person following the attention of the person next to them, until the whole table was looking at the man in the navy suit, in the corner, who had not said a word for the entire meeting and was now standing with the unhurried certainty of someone who had been waiting for exactly this moment. Ethan's expression didn't break, but I watched something move behind it, a flicker of recalculation, fast and involuntary, like a man checking a map and finding that the road he's been following has ended somewhere he didn't intend to go. "Mr. Stone," Ethan said with a smile that cost him something. "Of course, please." Victor looked at Ethan. Then he looked at the room. Then slowly, deliberately, with the quiet authority of a man who understood that some truths needed space around them to be received properly, he looked at the back row. At me, and I stood up. Victor spoke first. He did not raise his voice. He simply placed both hands flat on the table and said with the quiet authority of a man who had earned the right to say exactly this. "Before this meeting proceeds to execution, there is a matter of beneficial ownership that this room needs to understand." He opened the folder in front of him and slid a single page toward the center of the table. 25 years ago, Arthur Hayes and I entered into an equity participation agreement. Under that agreement, the Hayes Family Trust holds a 40% beneficial interest in the Stone Group, documented, legal, and never transferred or modified. He looked around the table slowly. "Every asset used as collateral in the development proposals you have been presented with today sits inside a financial structure that does not belong solely to Ethan Hayes. It belongs in significant part to his father." The room went so still I could hear the ventilation system in the ceiling. Ethan's mouth opened. No sound came out. His eyes moved from Victor to me, and what I saw in them was not anger. It was the particular vertigo of a man who has been standing on ground he believed was solid and has just felt it shift. I said nothing. I simply looked at my son across the length of that table and let the truth be present in the room without my help. Daniel stood next and placed Raymond Holt's medical documentation on the table, all 31 notarized pages of it, and spoke for 4 minutes in the precise, unhurried language of a man who has prepared every word and trusts every one of them. He explained the fabricated opinion. He explained the guardianship petition. He explained the protective clause Margaret had asked him to draft 5 years ago, and the moment October 10th, a restaurant on East 72nd Street, when it had been triggered. By the time he sat down, 3 of the institutional investors had already closed their folders. The applause had barely faded when my knees began to tremble beneath the conference table. Not from weakness, but from a relief so enormous, it felt like a weight I had carried for 5 years had finally slipped from my shoulders and crashed to the marble floor. Victor leaned towards me and gripped my forearm with both hands. His fingers were warm and steady, and his eyes, those sharp gray eyes that had seen decades of boardroom battles, were glistening at the corners. "It's done, Arthur," he said, his voice low and rough around the edges like gravel scraping stone. "It's finally done." I pressed my lips together hard and forced myself to breathe. "I never wanted it to come to this, Victor, not once. I know." He squeezed my arm tighter. "That's exactly why you were the only one who could do it right." Daniel was already on his feet across the room, sliding documents into his leather briefcase with the brisk efficiency of a man who had been waiting months for this moment. When he glanced up and caught my eye, he gave a single firm nod, the kind that needed no words behind it. The boardroom had emptied quickly. Richard Miller had been the first to leave, his face the color of old ash. His jaw so tight I thought his teeth might crack. Eleanor had followed 2 steps behind him, her heels stabbing the floor with every step, her chin held high, even as her hands clutched her handbag so hard the leather creased. Neither of them looked back. Ethan had been the last to move. He stood near the window for a long moment, staring out at the gray Manhattan skyline, his shoulders curved inward, like a man who had taken a punch he never saw coming. When he finally turned, his eyes landed on me, and something passed across his face that I had not seen in years. It was not anger. It was not calculation. It was something raw and fractured, something that looked for just one terrible second like the boy he used to be. My chest tightened so sharply I had to press a hand against it. I wanted to call out to him. I wanted to say his name, cross the room, tell him it did not have to be this way. But my feet stayed where they were because some doors, once a man chooses to walk through them, cannot simply be reopened from the outside. Ethan walked out without a word. Daniel appeared at my shoulder the moment the door clicked shut. "Are you all right?" he asked, his voice quiet and careful. "No," I admitted, and I was surprised by how steady my own voice came out. "But I will be. The trust amendment is filed," Daniel said. "The suspension of Ethan's beneficiary status is now a matter of public record within the trust instrument. The Hayes family trust is fully intact, and the 40% beneficial interest in the Stone Group has been formally reattributed to the trust under your sole authority as trustee." He paused. "The guardianship petition, the one Vanessa's attorney filed last week, has been dismissed. The judge rejected it this morning 30 minutes before the meeting started." The air rushed out of me in one long breath. 30 minutes, I repeated. 30 minutes, Daniel confirmed, and the corner of his mouth lifted just slightly. "Their attorney tried to delay the meeting using the petition as a basis. The judge said, and I quote, 'There is no evidence of incapacity. There is only evidence of a very patient man.'" A sound came out of me that surprised even myself, half laugh, half something that burned behind my eyes. Victor heard it from across the room and walked back over, raising an eyebrow. "Good news," Victor asked. "The guardianship petition was thrown out," Daniel said. Victor's face broke into the widest grin I had seen on him in 30 years. He grabbed my shoulder and shook it like we were young men again, standing outside a collapsing office building in the winter of 1993, with nothing but a handshake between us. "I told you," Victor said, his voice cracking just slightly at the edges. "I told you 30 years ago Arthur Hayes is not a man you bury. He's the kind of man who shows up at his own funeral and walks out the front door." I pressed the back of my hand against my mouth and blinked hard because my eyes had gone dangerously warm, and I was not going to cry in a boardroom. Not today. Not after everything. "There's one more thing," Daniel said, pulling a single folded sheet from his briefcase. "This arrived at my office this morning before the meeting. It's from Vanessa's attorney, not the guardianship one. The other one. Her personal counsel." I unfolded the paper. My reading glasses were in my breast pocket. I slid them on and read the 2 short paragraphs twice. Then I lowered the paper and looked at Daniel over the rims of my glasses. "She's withdrawing from the engagement," I said. Daniel gave a careful nod. "Effective immediately. Her attorney cites irreconcilable differences in financial expectations." He paused. "Which is, I believe, lawyer language for the money is gone." I folded the paper slowly and set it on the table. My hands were not trembling anymore. They were perfectly still, and that stillness felt unfamiliar, like a storm that had raged for so long. The quiet after it felt almost louder than the noise. "Where is Ethan now?" I asked. "He left the building," Daniel said. "His driver took him toward the Upper East Side." "He has not called you?" "No," I said. "He hasn't." Victor walked to the window and looked out, hands clasped behind his back. "He will," he said quietly. "Not today, but he will." I picked up Margaret's photograph from where I had set it on the table that morning. A small framed picture I had carried in my briefcase for 5 years, her face caught mid-laugh at some forgotten summer afternoon. I held it in both hands and ran my thumb along the frame. "I hope you're watching, Margaret," I said low enough that only the room could hear it. "I hope you know I listened." Daniel cleared his throat gently and reached for the last document in his briefcase, a clean white folder with the words, "The Margaret Hayes Community Foundation," printed across the front in clean, dark type. "Whenever you're ready," he said. I looked at the folder. I looked at her photograph. Then I set the photograph down, gently reached out, and took the folder in both hands. My grip firm, my eyes clear, my heart still aching, but no longer breaking. "I'm ready," I said. Let's build something worth leaving behind. 4 days after the shareholder meeting, the house in Greenwich felt different. Not emptier the way it had after Margaret passed, but quieter in a way that carried weight without crushing me. I had spent the first 2 mornings doing nothing more consequential than drinking coffee on the back porch, watching the last autumn leaves release themselves from the oak tree Margaret had planted the year Ethan was born. They fell slowly, one at a time, twisting in the cold air, before settling on the frozen ground. I watched each one and felt something in me settle alongside them. Daniel called on the third morning. "Arthur, it started," he said. I set the coffee pot down and gripped the phone with both hands. "Tell me," I said. "Greenfield Capital withdrew from Richard Miller's joint venture this morning. That's the fourth withdrawal in 4 days. 3 of Ethan's collateral-backed loans have been flagged for review, and 2 lenders have already issued formal notices demanding full disclosure of all trust-linked assets." Daniel exhaled carefully. "The engagement ring, the $400,000 ring, was purchased against a trust account that is now frozen. Vanessa's attorney is claiming she never knew the funds were trust-derived." "And Ethan?" I asked. "He's hired new counsel Harrison and Wolf Park Avenue. They wrote asking whether the trust terms could be renegotiated." A brief pause. I sent back 2 sentences informing them, "The instrument is irrevocable, and any modification requires your consent as sole trustee." "Which I won't give," I said. "Which I told them," Daniel replied. I sat down at the kitchen table, the same one where Margaret and I had eaten breakfast for 31 years, where Ethan had done his homework as a boy, where we had laughed and argued and grown old together. I ran my hand slowly across its surface, feeling every scratch and groove carved into the wood by decades of living. "What does Ethan actually have left?" I asked. "His company is still solvent for now, stock down 18% since Tuesday. He owns his apartment outright and holds 2 investment accounts outside the trust." Daniel's voice softened. "He is not ruined, Arthur. He is humbled. There is a meaningful difference between the two." I pressed 2 fingers against the bridge of my nose. "There is—" I agreed, my voice rougher than I intended. "Eleanor Miller gave an interview this morning," Daniel added. "She called the situation a tragic misunderstanding caused by an elderly man's irrational attachment to outdated financial structures." The sound that came out of me was not quite a laugh, but close. "The woman who attended every charity gala my outdated financial structure funded for 12 years. "Precisely," Daniel said, with a dryness earned over 2 decades of partnership. "Let her talk," I said. "I'm done being upset over people who were only ever interested in what I could give them." A brief warmth entered Daniel's voice. "Margaret would be proud of you right now. I mean that sincerely." My eyes burned fast and sharp. My throat closed for 3 full seconds. "Don't make me cry in my own kitchen, Daniel." "Apologies," he said, and I could hear him smiling. I straightened in my chair. "The Margaret Hayes Community Foundation, where do we stand? Filed with New York 4 days ago. The legal entity exists as of this week. $12 million from the trust has been transferred to the foundation account." He paused. "Victor Stone has pledged an additional $3 million. He asked me to tell you directly it's 30 years of interest." I laughed, warm, full, and completely genuine, the kind that surprised me with how good it felt moving through my chest. "That ridiculous man," I said, shaking my head, eyes still damp. "He also asked whether you had considered Bar Harbor," Daniel said carefully. I looked up at the ceiling. Bar Harbor. Margaret had talked for years about retiring somewhere with cold, salt air and lobster boats in the harbor, and mornings quiet enough to hear the water move. We had always said someday. Someday kept moving until she was gone, and the word itself started to hurt. "He has a small house on the water," Daniel continued. "He wants you to have it. He said Margaret mentioned it to him once, that she hoped you'd both end up somewhere with a porch and an ocean view." I walked to the window and looked at the oak tree in the backyard, bare now, every last leaf surrendered to the frost. Something moved through me that was not grief, not relief, not triumph. It was quieter and more complete than any of those things. The particular peace of a man who has carried a long and heavy truth and finally set it down somewhere it cannot be taken from him. "Tell Victor," I said, my voice steady and soft, "that I'll take it." The moving boxes were already stacked in the hallway when I heard the knock. 3 sharp raps against the old oak door, Ethan's knock, the same one he had used since he was a teenager, like he was announcing himself to a room that owed him entry. I stood at the end of the hallway with a half-folded sweater in my hands and felt my heart clench so hard it knocked the breath clean out of me. I set the sweater down and walked to the door. Ethan stood on the porch in a dark wool coat, no tie, his hair uncombed in a way I had never seen in the last decade. He looked like he had not slept in days, skin hollow beneath his eyes, jaw rough with stubble that had moved past deliberate and into desperate. He was 38 years old, and he looked exactly like the 12-year-old boy who had once come home with a split lip and refused to cry until he thought no one was watching. My throat tightened until it ached. "Dad," he said. His voice cracked on that single syllable like dry wood splitting under pressure. I stepped back and held the door open. "Come in, Ethan." He walked in slowly, his eyes moving across the stacked boxes, the bare walls, the half-dismantled bookshelf, taking in every sign of a life being packed away. Something crossed his face that looked like a man arriving at wreckage he helped cause. "You're really leaving," he said. "I am." I put the kettle on, needing something to do with my hands. "Sit down." He sat at the kitchen table, elbows forward, clasped hands pressed hard against his mouth. His shoulders curved inward under something enormous. "I didn't know about the guardianship petition," he said. "The falsified medical file, I didn't know she had gone that far." His eyes were red-rimmed and raw. "I knew about the asset transfer plan. I told myself it was aggressive, but legal." His voice broke completely. "I was wrong, Dad. I was so wrong, and I didn't let myself see it because I wanted to believe I was building something on my own." I set a mug in front of him and sat across the table. "Tell me about the party," I said. He flinched. "It was her idea. She said it would show people you were out of touch, that if you reacted badly, it would support the medical narrative. I told her you wouldn't react badly. She said leaving quietly would work just as well." He dragged a hand hard across his jaw. And I stood there and said nothing. For 1 second I thought maybe she was right, that maybe I needed something drastic to get free. He pressed his fist against his chest like something inside was physically breaking. The moment I thought that I hated myself, but I didn't stop it. The pain those words carried was sharp enough to find every old scar at once. I breathed through it slowly. "What happened at that party hurt me in a way I'll carry for a long time," I said. "And what you and Vanessa planned put everything your mother and I built at risk. Everything she worked to protect, even from the grave." Ethan's face crumpled. His shoulders shook twice hard, fighting shudders, and then the sound tore out of him, ragged and wretched. He pressed his fist against his mouth, but his eyes spilled over, and he stopped fighting it entirely. I looked at the ceiling until I could trust myself again. "Vanessa filed papers yesterday," he said, when he could speak. His voice was stripped completely bare. "She said the financial situation wasn't what she'd been led to believe." A short, hollow laugh. "Extraordinary, given that she was the one doing the leading. I have almost nothing left that she didn't touch," he continued. "The apartment, 2 accounts, my company barely." He looked up at me, eyes raw and searching. "I'm not here to ask you to fix it. I came because I needed you to know that I see it, all of it. What I did, what it cost." His voice fractured one final time. "And because I needed to see your face before you left, even if that's all I get." I stood, walked around the table, and placed my hand on the back of my son's neck, the way I had when he was small and frightened and needed to know that someone was still there. "I'm not shutting this door," I said quietly. but I'm not opening it all the way. Not yet. What you rebuild your company, your character, your name you rebuild without my money and without my interference. That is not punishment, Ethan. That is the only way you will ever trust yourself again. He reached up and grabbed my wrist with both hands, holding on like a man who had been underwater and had just broken the surface. I know, he said. His voice was a wreck. I know, Dad. I stood there with my hand on his neck and let him breathe. The first morning I woke up in Bar Harbor, I lay still and listened to the ocean before I opened my eyes. It was not the dull roar I had expected. It was something more textured, more patient. A long, slow exhale of water against rock, a hiss of retreating foam, then a pause so complete it almost hurt. Then it came again. Enormous, unhurried, indifferent to every boardroom and every broken plan I had left behind in Manhattan. I opened my eyes to a ceiling I did not recognize in a room that smelled of salt air and old pine. For the first time in longer than I could calculate, the first feeling of the morning was not dread. I pulled on my coat over my pajamas like a man with absolutely no one to impress and walked out onto the porch. Victor was already there, sitting with a mug in both hands, his white hair blown sideways by the wind off the water. He heard the screen door and turned, and the grin that broke across his face was so wide and so immediate, it made my chest feel open in a way I had forgotten was possible. There he is, Victor said. I was starting to think you'd sleep until February. It's 6:30 in the morning, Victor. Exactly. Half the day gone. He held out a second mug, already poured steam curling in the cold air. Black with half a spoon of sugar, the way Margaret made it. My hand stopped on the mug for just a moment. My throat tightened so sharply I had to breathe through my nose twice before I could speak. You remembered that, she told me at your anniversary dinner, 1997. His voice softened. She said you always complained about sugar in coffee but secretly preferred it. She laughed when she said it. A pause. She had a great laugh, Arthur. She did, I said. My eyes went warm and I let them because I was 69 years old on a porch above the Atlantic, and I was done apologizing for loving my wife. Daniel called yesterday, Victor said after a moment. The Margaret Hayes Community Foundation already received its first grant application, an elementary school in the South Bronx Arts tutoring reading support. Already, I turned to him. Word travels fast when 12 million enters the nonprofit world. He paused, then added carefully, Ethan contacted the foundation too, not for money. He offered pro bono real estate consultation, finding sites for community centers, tutoring spaces. He said he wanted to contribute something that wasn't about him. The pain and the pride arrived together, the way they always did with Ethan. I pressed my hand flat against my chest and breathed through both of them. That boy, I said, my voice rougher than I intended. That boy, Victor said gently, is trying. I reached into my coat pocket and pulled out the last page of Margaret's letter on soft at the folds from how many times I had read it. I held it against the arm of the chair without reading it aloud and said quietly, She wrote that she hoped wherever I ended up, I could hear the water. Victor looked out at the ocean. She always knew what you needed before you did. Yes, I said, she always did. The sun was rising now, not all at once, but gently the way a Maine winter morning arrives, careful not to disturb anything that has finally come to rest. The water caught the light in small, scattered pieces, and the whole surface of the Atlantic shivered with something that looked from where I was sitting very much like grace. I lifted my mug toward the horizon. To Margaret, I said. Victor raised his. To Margaret, and to stubborn old men who outlast every plan made against them. I laughed deep and full and real, and the sound of it sent 2 seabirds off the railing and out over the water. I watched them until they were small enough to be mistaken for punctuation marks against the morning sky. This is enough, I thought. This is exactly enough. Looking back on everything that happened, I think about something I once read in a quiet little church. Margaret used to love a verse that said, God does not give us more than we can bear, but he does ask us to bear it with grace. I tried. Some days I failed, but I kept trying. If there is one thing this family story taught me, it is this: I was too quiet for too long. I told myself patience was a virtue, and it is, but silence in the face of cruelty is not patience. It is permission. Do not make my mistake. Do not wait until everything is broken before you speak. The people who love you deserve your honesty far more than they deserve your endurance. My personal belief, and I say this as a man who has lost, who has been betrayed, and who has somehow found his way to a porch above the ocean, is that dignity is never given to you by others. It is something you carry yourself, protect yourself, and reclaim yourself no matter how many hands try to take it. These grandpa stories are not just mine. They belong to every father who has ever stood at a door wondering whether to open it. Every family carries its fractures. What matters is whether you choose to heal them or hide them. If this family story moved something in you, I would love to know. Leave a comment below. Tell me which moment stayed with you longest. Share this with someone who needs to hear it. And if these grandpa stories have earned a place in your day, a subscription means the world to a stubborn old man in Maine. Thank you truly for staying with me until the very end of this grandpa story and this family story that was never easy to tell. And one last word of honesty: some of the stories coming next contain fictional elements crafted with care for the purpose of sharing life's deeper lessons. If that is not the journey you wish to take, there is no judgment here. Step away and find the content that speaks to your heart. But if you stay, I promise to give you everything I have.